Week 6, we continue with the reading and the discussion of the first chapters of The Godfather by Mario Puzo. And then on Thursday, we discuss and watch scenes from the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a classic in the gangster genre, directed by Roger Corman, one of the pillars of modern Hollywood, directed more than 50 movies and produced almost 400. The king of B-movies, especially in the horror genre, science fiction as well, but he mentored scores of influential modern directors, including Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, and several others. The film came out in 1967, so we're getting closer to the time of The Godfather, and this allows us to see what The Godfather brought to the genre even better. Today, though, I want to start with something different. I corrected most of the assignments, at least those that were submitted during the weekend, with the exception, I think, of 3, and provided feedback, comments. I invite you to come and discuss those comments or any issue that I can help you address. But based on what I read in your assignments, I thought it might be best to go over some of the nuances in the distinction, for example, between influence and manipulation, influence and deterrence, with the help of simple examples. Don't forget this schema and the way it works. Always keep this as your cheat sheet when you're working on an assignment. So you have the Machiavellian idea that power means control, but control over an outcome, right? So power has to be measured against a specific outcome. I might say the President of the United States has a lot of power. That's a useless truth. The only way I can evaluate that power is to examine a specific context. Does the President of the United States have the power to bring the Ukraine-Russia conflict to an end, for example, etc.? So don't forget that power means control, but control has to be measured against a specific outcome, which means that in Machiavellian terms, power is not perennial, is not vague or universal, has to be renewed, maintained, or grown in reference to different outcomes. And when it comes to the outcome, especially outside of the world of politics, which is necessarily Machiavellian, always evaluate the element of necessity. Otherwise, we're not in the realm of Machiavellianism, we're dealing with narcissism of some kind. So, for example, in reference to Sonny, the mafioso of A Bronx Tale, was it necessary for Sonny to kill the guy who was trying to bash the head of Joe Pesci at the beginning of the movie? Of course, because killing the guy was the safest and most expedient solution right then and there. It was not the cleanest and clearly exposed Sonny to a big risk because another kid, less smart, less savvy than Calogero, might have identified him. Calogero, however, is aware of the social context in which his family lives and has absorbed indirectly some ideas of how to behave in similar situations. For example, you try to do the right thing, but you don't get involved in things having to do with the mafia, and sometimes, therefore, you have to do the right thing for the wrong person or for a bad person. Predictability and repeatability are just criteria that allow us to establish that a strategy deployed to achieve an outcome was not the result of positive circumstances or sheer luck, but that strategy is actually effective. Then you have the two sides of this schema And this side is the more direct use of power through force or through the threat of the use of force, which is deterrence, or in Machiavellian, simpler jargon, even the jargon of Sony, fear, right? So you are controlling more or less other people in an active way. You're actively using control. Where on the other side, the use of power is indirect, and you don't have to directly, actively pursue this, because influence might come with your persona. For example, Sony has influence over kids such as Calogero long before they establish a direct relationship. So from a distance, without Sony doing anything, without him targeting Calogero, Calogero feels the influence. And then, once Calogero becomes connected to Sony, he himself gains some influence. For example, we see that through the reaction, the behavior of the peddler who will donate vegetables to Calogero, because Calogero is friends with Sony. So let me show you the examples that I prepared to go more into the discussion of some of the nuances between influence manipulation, for example, etc. And of course, feel free to ask questions or offer a commentary, possibly to expand this to similar examples. I prepared two scenarios. The first is positive, the first is negative. By positive, I mean whether or not someone who finds himself in this scenario will engage in active behavior pursuant to the outcome that is desired by the other person. The next example will be negative, meaning whether or not the person who's targeted will engage or refrain from engaging in behavior in a situation that leads to the possibility of a contrast rather than collaboration. These are the key terms, right? Cooperation, collaboration, influence, manipulation, authority, compellence, and force. Compellence is simply the opposite of deterrence. Deterrence stops you from doing something, right? Cold War, the US and Russia, the USSR, have nuclear missiles, and this deter each from attacking the other. Compellence is the opposite, meaning that I feel compelled to do something without the need for someone to point a gun at me. And I'll go through the other terms through the examples. Let's look at the scenario, okay? It's carefully drafted to elucidate some of the dynamics that we will find in other situations. So imagine that you are walking on a small road, a back road, as you find around small villages of Long Island. You see a car ahead of you. The car has stopped. They have a flat tire. It's by the side of the road. You see that the spare tire is out. Indulge me, I know that these days most people don't have a spare tire in their trunk, but I needed this situation to play out in a certain way. I need to have visual evidence so that you can read the situation to a degree. The spare tire is out. Various tools that are normally used to change a tire are scattered around the car. Okay, scattered is the key term. You walk by the car. Eventually, you come to that point. And please note that I intentionally put you as a walker in the scene, because if you're a driver, first of all, you can just speed up. Well, it's crafted in a way that you would have to slow down, right? And therefore, you would be exposed to communication with this person. However, the car itself can be considered a weapon, so you wouldn't be powerless in this situation, right? If someone pulled a gun in that situation, you could just speed up, hit the person, and continue if you were brave enough to do that. But certainly you can imagine that kind of reaction. No, in this case you're walking, and of course you could walk back or ran away. But again, indulge me and let's see how this plays out. Will you stop and help? So the outcome in this situation, the potential desired outcome is for the person to have your cooperation and collaboration, support in changing the tire, right? You can see that. And to what extent they might be able to control your behavior. And depending on this, the direct or indirect control, we fall into one of those categories, and this hopefully is, this fictional example is vivid enough to fixate some of the concepts on you. So let's imagine different roles, different profiles for the other person. So the first level is, say, in this scenario, the person around the car is a non-threatening stranger. By non-threatening, I mean that you don't see any visible signs that would make you fear for your safety. So imagine, for example, you're a woman and the other person is a woman about your age. You're a Stony Brook student and the other person is about your age and they have a Seawolf t-shirt. You're a soccer fan and the other person is someone your age with a Barcelona jersey with Messi's name there, right? However, you would define signs that make you not feel threatened. Okay, so will you stop and help? And if you do, where would your behavior fall? Would it be the result of some degree of control by the other? Hardly so. This is the level that I would categorize as cooperation. And believe it or not, we are naturally cooperative as humans, and we grow out of it. Kids tend to be cooperative, and then of course they're instilled a lot of fears, especially in reference to helping strangers, right? But naturally, even through psychological tests of various nature, our natural inclination is to be cooperative, and our society works that way, right? When you're driving on the road, you don't even imagine that someone coming from the opposite direction will steer the car on your path, and or if you are walking, try to hit you, right? Because our society works based on the fact that most people, the vast majority of people, will engage in all kinds of direct and indirect cooperative games. And the difference between cooperation and collaboration linguistically can be subtle, can be ignored, but if you want that, cooperation is where you maintain your individual persona. The other person can be a stranger, can be an acquaintance, such as a colleague, right? And you just work together to a goal, in this case, change the will, if you want to help, okay? Whereas collaboration is something that is based on a closer bond or some form of familiarity and intimacy, okay? You cooperate with your colleagues, you collaborate with your family setting up the table, let's say, okay? So there is no Machiavellianism on either side when you help a non-threatening stranger change the tire. You might do it, not do it, but it's pretty much 50-50. And where is 50-50, there is no Machiavellianism, right? If it's a neighbor, a friend, or a relative, you probably stop, right? But again, you'll stop because you know them, but and you know that you'll have to see them again, right? But again, it's not a Machiavellian strategy or behavior, it's just a collaborative strategy. It's a step farther from cooperation into collaboration because there is a closer connection to these people. Let's say, though, that the person next to the car is your favorite celebrity. So fill the blank, Taylor Swift, it's Brad Pitt, whoever. I don't know you guys, there is a vast gender gap. So I don't know, for me it might be a Formula One driver. Okay. Will you be inclined to stop and change the tire? So let's open the discussion, be frank, name that celebrity, and tell me sincerely what you would do in that situation. There is no one else around, okay? And let's say there is no reception, right? It's an area where you cannot receive or make phone calls. There are some areas on Long Island that are like that, okay? So let's hear a few reactions to this. Yes?
Well,
and your celebrity, the celebrity you have in mind would be, give us a name.
probably Shamar Aspen. It's a football player.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Okay, so you would help. Who else? So, some other examples of this situation. What do you have in mind? Come on, it's simple enough. Give me a celebrity and your reaction.
Yeah, I would do it.
For whom specifically?
Tom Morello.
Pardon me?
Tom Morello.
Who is?
He's the guitar player for Rage Against the Machine.
Okay, great. Okay. So, how would you classify that? Now we are in a territory that is Machiavellian, because this would be a typical example of influence. Influence is an indirect form of control because this person has done nothing to you directly. Of course, they've done a lot to build their public persona, to build their artistic or sports career, right? There is a long time commitment, a lot of energy, resources, and time went into building this public image. But as far as the situation, the context, there is no attempt, at least at this point, before they speak to you, to influence you, to do anything to control you. But they do have power. And that indirect power can be classified as influence through building their celebrity status. They've gained that influence. And people of this level usually know they have influence, of course. And they can exploit that and be manipulative. That's why I said before they even talk to you. Because after they start speaking to you, they can say things to manipulate you, right? They can promise tickets, they can promise anything, but it's just a promise, right? So potentially you could get swindled and then be ignored. They could give you a phone number, but then you could be blocked or completely ignored when you call them or find out it's not the correct phone number. But your favorite celebrity just standing by the side of the road has a lot of influence over your decision. Right? A stranger who appears to be limping or somebody with a story represent different forms of control because they could be cases of manipulation. Right? So somebody who's kind of a calm man might fake a limp when a younger person is walking there simply to manipulate you into changing the wheel or helping them change the wheel, and then they'll get into their car and continue on with their lives. Again, manipulation is also indirect because the greatest cons happen with voluntary participation from the target or the victim. I don't have to say anything, I just read you, your profile, your personality, and I'm not even looking at you, I'm just busying myself around the car with this visible and strenuous limp, and then I wait for my trap, which is set to attract the victim, the target. And you, being the kind of guys that you are, you might probably help, but this could be a case of manipulation. It is even more true for somebody with a story. So somebody stops you, and instead of simply saying, "Can you help me change the wheel?" they get into some kind of lengthy story about the reasons why they need help. or a story that comes before any request. And then you find yourself in an awkward situation where either you have to refute the story, or you're forced to believe, even reluctantly, because you feel that there is something up, but you might be manipulating. Essentially, you're being manipulating into helping. Okay? So we have cooperation, the non-threatening stranger, collaboration. Those are both voluntary, but there is no control, and therefore we're not in a Machiavellian area. Then we have influence and manipulation, which are very Machiavellian, because we do find an effort to exercise control by the other person over the goal, and you become involved in this. Next would be somebody who's showing you a badge. Again, even before they say anything, they show you a badge, first to show that you shouldn't be threatened by them, and then perhaps they can leverage that authority to get you to help them with the will. And again, if the badge is fake, then clearly this would be, again, manipulation. If the badge is real, it's not exactly influence, it's a more specific portion of influence, which is authority. You don't know the person, you don't know who they are, where they work, what they do, but you symbolically acknowledge the authority they have in society, right? And it's a form of influence in this case, right? Because, again, we're not talking about somebody showing you a badge when they stop the car, stopping you at a roadblock, right? It's a different kind of situation. They have a flat tire. Finally, somebody with a gun. Now, there are two scenarios to this. One is much less plausible. That is to say, if you can imagine somebody showing you they have a gun without reaching for it, it'll work better in the next scenario. But if you can imagine, it sounds more like a film than a real life situation. You see they have a gun, but they're not using the gun or reaching for the gun. They're not pointing the gun at you. In that case, that would be compellence, right? Because I'm not using the gun, pointing the gun, using the gun would be force, right? Even if I don't shoot the gun, it's force, right? Because there comes a point where the use of force and the use of deterrence blur, and even in the eye of the law, somebody pointing the gun at you is already a crime, even if the gun is not, even if they don't shoot the gun at you or shoot the gun in the air, etc. However, if they just hinted to the fact they have a gun to pressure you, that might be considered compellence, but would you stick around to change that will, or would you take your chances and run away, for example, before they can pull the gun, right? So it's not a perfect example of compellence, but compellence would be, I'm doing something for you because I know that you have the means to use force against me. Okay? Is that clear enough? Although it becomes far-fetched in this situation, everything else is real enough, plausible enough, with the exception of that. Any questions or comments about this first scenario, and does it help you differentiate between a natural impulse to cooperate or collaborate and Machiavellian situations where I'm the target, I'm on the receiving end of influence, manipulation, I acknowledge the authority of someone else, or I'm the target and the victim of force or something close to the deployment of force. Okay? Next scenario. Imagine you are in a club. For people my age, it would be a disco. Okay? Imagine how many times I've been in a disco, of course. And so you're in your favorite club, you're on the dance floor, you're having fun, you're a bit drunk, right? As things might go on in Saturday night or Friday night. And somebody on the floor bumps harshly into you, right? And you don't see them. You just feel their shoulder. You feel that, you feel some pain, and clearly you're angry, you turn against them, and how will you react? Here we're in the negative. That is to say, how much control do they have over your reaction? And in which situation your reaction might be restricted, limited, or totally inhibited even. So let's go a series of profiles for the next person, starting with the usual non-threatening stranger. Again, it's a neutral kind of situation. You might react verbally, you might react physically because you're drunk enough that you've become aggressive, but there is no control on either side. That's the thing. And therefore, it's not a Machiavellian game. There is no Machiavelli to be used fruitfully if the context doesn't warrant it. And there are situations where there is no Machiavellian strategy immediately available to you. Again, if it is a close friend, a relative, or a friend's friend, probably you will not react so aggressively or in such a hostile way, right? But again, it might go either way, and there is no way to predict how it will go. When you put in that situation your favorite celebrity, then most probably your reaction will be, oh, nothing, don't worry, it's fine. So you'll be more than non-confrontational. You'll probably be friendly. But your friendliness is not the natural reaction in this situation, and that leads you to believe that there is some influence controlling your reaction, right? So we're entering a Machiavellian area. Let's say that someone, when you turn angrily, shows you a badge. Again, is the badge fake? In that case, this would be what? Manipulation, right? So they're exploiting the fake badge to stop you, to control you. If it is a real badge, then it would be authority, which is a specific form of influence, often mediated through symbolic cues, because in some situations, people will be dressed in a certain way, the mafiosi, the policeman, or will have some visible elements. The badge is one, a gun or a police baton may be another, and so on and so forth. If someone is, you turn and you find yourself facing this big bouncer, right? Big man, a lot of muscles. What will you do? And what kind of situation, what level of control would that be? In this case, we're entering, in a most classical sense, the area of deterrence. Because those muscles, and possibly the whole demeanor of the bouncer, I put the bouncer intentionally because there used to, I don't know about the bouncers you encounter now, but there used to be a time when bouncers were kind of frightening, right? Not the friendliest guys. Maybe now they're refined, they have a license, they go to some kind of therapy for their anger, but this would be deterrence. That is to say, you stop because you know that they can hurt you, right? Because they're so bigger than you are. So they don't have to do anything. They don't have to say anything. That's why it's indirect. But it's deterrence, and it stops you, right? And that's why people will have big bodyguards, for example, around them, etc. Now, this is the best version of the example we found earlier about a gun that is not taken out and pointed at you. That is to say, imagine this person is a man with a suit And instead of saying or doing anything, they casually open the side of their jacket enough for you, not everyone involved around you, but enough for you to see they have a gun in their holster on the side of their body, under their armpit, etc. So this too would be an example of deterrence. Because they just showed you the gun, they haven't touched the gun, they haven't done anything actively, right? So it's just like the USSR showing America, the USA, that they have the atomic bomb after the war, right? You cannot attack us, you cannot do to us what you did to Germany and Japan, because we have the atomic bomb, and we'll detonate a few to show you that it's real. If somebody, however, is reaching for the gun and pointing the gun at you, that would be force, whether or not the gun is detonated, right? Whether or not they shoot the gun in the air or at you in any way, okay? So once again, we have neutral territory, we have influence, we have manipulation, we have deterrence, more deterrence, right? Because showing a gun is even more than showing your bulging muscles, and you have force, even if the gun is not used, but just pointed at you for however brief a time. Is this helpful? Is this more clear? Questions, comments, reactions, possibly personal examples if you found yourself in a situation where you felt compelled to do something against your will, against your instinct, or, like in the second slide of this kind, a situation where you felt that your reaction was inhibited to a degree because of what you read in the situation. Anyone? Any personal examples of situations where you felt compelled to do something or restricted from doing something? And of course, these things in different ways are a matter of the fabric of life, right? If you deal with a professor, automatically you inhibit certain reactions, right? Automatically you behave in a certain way. You wouldn't react the same way that you would talking to a friend, right? So there is a spectrum of situations where your behavioral reactions are inhibited or controlled, right? Questions, comments? No one will give us an anecdote. Lisa?
I guess this is examples, but how would any of these change depending on, say, like the intention of the profiled person? Like a bouncer, for example, if he bumps into you and he's a big guy, but then he turns out and says, "Oh, no, I'm so sorry.
Of course.
Would that change the...
Yeah. Each of these scenarios would play out differently depending on what they do.
Yeah.
That's why I left it intentionally at this initial stage where you read the situation and you decide what to do before they say anything or before they say much. Well, in the other case, I also had the story,
Yeah.
but there too, you are forced to maintain passivity in most instances, right? Because out of politeness, you would let the story play out before you decide to believe and play along, or say, don't bother me, or what are you telling me? I don't believe that, etc. So yeah, you're right. This would be different depending on the actual intentions and pursuits of the other person, and to what degree they want to gain control of the situation, in this case to restrict you from attacking them or even reacting in a disrespectful way. In the other case, whether or not they're in fact trying to obtain the help of a stranger in changing the will deceitfully rather than asking and letting the other person decide whether they want to or not. So yeah, we would have to go into the intricacies of the various possible scenarios. So yeah, even the bouncer or the bodybuilder might be a sweet guy apologizing and realizing that that they're moving awkwardly in that space, or the space is crowded and therefore they never intended to cause you any pain. But if we develop this, then we would have also to develop the other side. Let's say one of these persons asks you to share a drink. They want to offer you a drink to make up for this. And again, you have to decide whether or not you have enough control of that situation. You trust this person, or is this some trick to get you to drink perhaps a cocktail where somebody might slip a roofie, right? And how will this end for you, etc. So again, we would go deeper into the discussion of who controls the situation, and if you're goofily having fun, and if you in fact you're drunk enough, you might be targeted by someone for that very reason, right? Because that also means less control for you and possibly more control for them in this particular situation. But then in Machiavellian terms, it depends on how you define the context. Are you alone, or are you with a group of people? And therefore, even whatever happens to you, whether you're the victim of threats of violence, or somebody's trying to take you to have drinks, are the people with you keeping an eye on you and therefore willing to support you, protect you, defend you from an attacker or a deceitful attack to your health, to your body, etc. Right? Okay? But keep in mind the basics, right, when you go through the scenes or scenes of the novel or the scenes from a film. Let me go back to just a few examples of passages I highlighted from the first chapters, especially the very first chapter of Puzo, because I want to show you what elements I'm looking for. I can read this in many different ways, but I'm reading this in a Machiavellian way. So I'm looking for elements of power or strategies that have to do with force, with deterrence, with influence, with manipulation. So at the very beginning, as I mentioned last week, we have exemplary characters who will end up, because of their respective situations, asking for favors from Don Vito Corleone. One of them is the undertaker Amerigo Bonasera, whose daughter was not raped but violently beat up by men she went out to have a drink with. And Amerigo is in a tribunal waiting for the sentence, and clearly he's virtually powerless. He's represented as waiting for justice. And the very use of the verb waiting highlights his passivity, because he has no control over this situation. He can only wait and hope that justice, which he has a right to as a citizen, will be granted to him. And this, of course, also places the character within the hierarchy of regular society and outside of organized crime. On the other side, the person he's dealing with is not the perpetrators, but rather the judge, because the judge is holding the power. So the very first page is already about a power struggle and a struggle for control over the outcome. The outcome desired by Amerigo is for these guys to end up in prison for several years. But he has no control over the authority of the judge, right? His face was cold, meaning you cannot influence me even if you are the father. And the reference to majestic contempt is also the reference to the position and the role of the judge and his own authority, right? the conventional impartiality of the judge, or the signs, the visual cues you associate with this position in society. You can only stay back and hope for the best, right? But then, in the hierarchy of society, even judges are subject to the influence, but not to the influence of people from the lower or middle classes, such as Amerigo. He can be influenced by fine families, such as those of the perpetrators, and therefore there is a hint that the judge's decision is influenced by wealth, by social influence over him, and therefore the sentence is ridiculous. Just a minor conviction, 3 years, but with suspension, and therefore they can walk free. And Bonasera, who wanted to play the part of the model immigrant, the model American citizen, is forced to go to another hierarchy. But this hierarchy is overlapping. At this point, you can imagine that Bonasera understood that someone better connected than he was influenced the decision of the judge, and now he's looking for a way to regain control over the situation by using Don Corleone. But his intention is in fact that of using Don Corleone as an instrument of justice and not just ask for a simple favor. The second person whose situation will bring him the day of the marriage at the beginning of the film to talk to Don Corleone and invoke his help is Johnny Fontaine, the Frank Sinatra-esque singer-actor of the book and the film. And through these characters we see who Don Corleone is, right? So for example, when Johnny thinks of Don Corleone, he thinks of power, wisdom, and love. And these are essential elements of the novel. Power, we recognize as a keyword, right? Very Machiavellian. Wisdom is the idea that is also Machiavellian, that power cannot be just force. Has to be wisdom, meaning has to be a careful, planned, calculated use of force and influence. Love in The Godfather, family love, because this is what we're talking about. Johnny lost his father and Don Vito became his godfather and a father figure. Family love is another important theme in the novel and the film, because this is what every character is trying to get to, from emerging from a situation where they first and foremost have to use power, force, or cunning in order to protect their family. But once they deploy force, cunning, deceit, then the family dissolves. The family becomes an additional victim to their use of excessive power, right? You have the baker who has an assistant, Enzo, who's a prisoner of war, about to be sent back to Italy, and he wants Enzo to become his father, his son-in-law, and he's trying to take preventative steps before this relationship between Enzo and his daughter gets to a point where she carries a child, right? So the way the baker, looks at Don Vito from his vantage point is that Don Vito is a man you can rely on. That he will not make a promise that he cannot keep, and certainly he will not make excuses, meaning he's not a victim of fate, right? He's very much in control of his life, and he can use that control to help other people. And if he tells you that the outcome you request is granted to you, then there is a guarantee in that promise. In return, however, you have to make it visible that you are under the influence of Don Vito, that you show respect to him, and this respect will reinforce Don Vito's standing in the community. Keep in mind that Don Vito is modeled after Carlo Gambino, and Carlo Gambino, in fact, in the 1950s was having every week half a day where he would receive people. People would line up around his office, and people would come in, people from the Italian American community for the most part, would go in and ask him for favors and would listen to him and help them in different ways. This much we know, and you can find plenty of documents, websites or videos about Carlo Gambino if you're more curious. So the respect that the baker has shown and will continue to show to Carlo feeds the power of Don Vito. So, and this is one of the brilliant intuitions of Machiavelli, that even the most powerful tyrant cannot ignore their subjects. That he has to make sure that subjects respect him, love him, fear him. Because otherwise you would have to point a gun at everyone. And going back to the same situation, you can certainly point a gun at someone in a club on the dance floor, but how many times can you point a gun at people on the dance floor before the entire situation becomes a completely chaotic, a brawl or a riot, or people escaping in all directions and you lose control completely, right? Whereas if you are, let's say, a celebrity who's trying to navigate the floor, people will probably open the path to you, etc. Okay? And here you see how the baker is cultivating the relationship by giving gifts. And the difference between Bonasera and the baker is that Bonasera is demanding help. And the baker, even when he didn't need any favor, was showering Don Vito with visible signs of his appreciation and respect. Something that will be visible throughout the community and will make the immaterial power of Don Vito over the community evident. Okay? And of course, when you get a favor, then you have to return this favor, and this is well known in the practice of the mafia, both in Italy and in the US, right? You find plenty of examples of that in films. The next passages have to do with the description of the three sons with different qualities. You have Sonny, who is powerful, courageous, but lacks judgment, lacks brain, lacks the ability to think things over before acting, and therefore control a calculated use of violence and force, for example. And this opens him, in fact, to manipulation, as we will see by his own father. Fredo is too agreeable, too compliant, and therefore not a leader by nature. And then you have the Goldilocks of the brother, Michael Corleone, who is both educated, smart, and also forceful, driven, and able to use force whenever necessary. Okay? The very fact that he's keeping his distance from the rest of the family is a sign of leadership. It's not simply the obedient son. It's someone who's tracing his own path through life. His choice of a partner testifies to that, right? And then, of course, this will generate, exactly because she's also independent, a thinker, someone who wants to decide, have this deciding power, the power to decide over her life. This will provoke a contrast when Michael has to play the part of the protector, because that role itself is in conflict with her independence. Okay. So this is Michael again. Look at the keywords to describe his character. Quiet force, meaning is not impulsive in the use of force. That is reflected upon the use of force. That's the quiet part. And has intelligence, right? So is able, intelligence is more than calculating the use of force, is being able to develop influence over other people, but he can intimidate others, right? The born instinct to act in such a way that man had no recourse but to respect him means he has charisma. And again, independent from his father. This is where you see how Sonny can be manipulated. And this is an example of manipulation, right? Where a father will tell his son, oh, there are people outside, I don't know, on the street, they can do what they please. Notice that it's disagreeable. It's not comforting his son in any way. Yes, I know you're right. Thank you for telling me that. But please keep this in mind. No, he's intentionally disagreeable so that Sonny will go out and start in the film smashing cameras in here, pushing, shoving people around, showing his anger visibly. And then you find that this was intended to happen by his manipulative father. The tantrum of Sonny served the purpose. It would convince the interlopers, the FBI, that their presence was unexpected and unprepared for. So you know that Sonny cannot be the leader, right? He's easily manipulated. His own impulsivity exposes him to manipulation, right? And the rest is about the time. There is a time when you can act. That's not the time, the wedding, to act against the FBI. But if needed, Don Corleone would have the power. And this is the anticipation, right, of what will happen with Waltz, the producer, who's a friend of Edgar J. Hoover, head of the FBI, and this will not protect him from Don Corleone. But that was the time to ignore the power and the authority of the FBI, not this one. Okay? And let me skip a few things. Okay, this too as well. Other people coming to ask, and we talked about Luca Brasi, so I'll skip this. Let me get to. And there is the issue, of course, of Sollozzo. Sollozzo wants to get the influence of the Godfather to protect his traffic of drugs. The Godfather doesn't want to play along, and this will generate the attempted murder against him that will require Michael to take the reins of the situation, right, and get involved with his father's business. This is more interesting. We can stop over this one. So in here, you have a senator who's trying to show his respect to the family by giving them some silver gift picked with great taste. So it's not just an expensive gift, but something that feels like the personal choice of the senator, right? So the senator is showing respect, respect being the other side of influence. If you respect someone, it means the other person has influence over you. But then look at the passage in green, which highlights the two sides of Machiavellian ideology. The senator, like Luca Brasi, was one of the greatest stones in the Don's power structure. So to be powerful, you need influence and connections, the senator, and you need the ability to use force, which is Luca Brasi, the murderer. You can't have one without the other. That's Machiavelli's core belief. Machiavelli has in mind Savonarola, the Dominican friar who prompted the creation of a social movement with tens of thousands of people in Florence in the 1490s, but then he didn't have any force to protect himself and ended up burned in Piazza della Signoria. And on the other side of this equation, as I said before, even the most powerful leader cannot be relying on force the whole time. They have to use influence. Okay? So going back, for example, going back to the initial examples of Sonny, was it necessary for Sonny to kill the guy who was trying to smash Joe Pesci's head with a baseball bat? Yes, there was no alternative for him. Eventually, at the end of the film, he pays the price because the son of this guy who was killed comes to kill him. But what's the alternative for him? Can Sonny be having a gun in his hand the whole time, or be killing every relative of the victims that he creates along the way? It's impossible, and even if he did, there would be just a chain, a domino effect, more people trying to take revenge. And Machiavelli himself, in a passage, hints to the fact that no leader, no matter how powerful they are, no leader is completely safe. That it is always possible for someone to reach out to you, to be able to stab you or kill you. And what he had in mind, in fact, was the famous conspiracy against the Medicis in 1478, when Lorenzo and his brother Julian went to church, and in the church itself, members of the Pazzi family tried to stab them. Julian died, Lorenzo was wounded, and then the Pazzi were arrested, tortured, some of them killed as a consequence. Okay, this is the story linked to the famous trademark phrase, an offer that you cannot refuse, where Don Corleone helps Johnny, the Frank Sinatra character, get out of a contract. And this is, in fact, was also Frank Sinatra's situation, that early on in the 1930s he assigned a contract that granted him very little money for his concerts, and he needed to get out of that contract without paying a penalty. But notice the beauty of the setup of this scene, because you have Don Corleone, who goes to see this band leader himself, accompanied by his consigliori, Abandando, which represents influence, Luca Brasi, who represents force. But then they're not being used. They're there visibly and symbolically. And Don handles the negotiation with a check and with words. The words are, of course, supported by the threat of a gunshot to the head. But you have to wonder, why then write the check? If they're using a gun and this threat to make the band leader sign the release of Johnny Fontaine, why give him money anyway? And you tell me, what are your ideas? What's the significance of this? Why not just use force? The result is guaranteed, apparently. What is that is achieved by giving this person money after they are forced to sign the contract? What kind of situation are we getting into in terms of power dynamics? Chris or Lisa, or I don't know if anyone else has.
Well, I was going to say, you keep that network of influence. You're not like birthing that asset, if that makes sense.
You're getting them directly involved.
Yeah.
If you're forcing them, they can resist, right? They find personally in a situation where they have no alternatives as regular people, as non-combatant civilians, right? This person is not a warrior, is not Tom Cruise or whoever, Jason Statham, whoever would be able to disentangle themselves, grab the gun, shoot everyone around and come out of that situation. However, with the check, and by accepting the check, they're complying in a more voluntary way. Because this time, I could read the check, but it's up to me. And this person surely will cash the check. And at that point, they cannot renege the contract saying, I did it under duress, because they cashed the check. So they moved seamlessly, in a seamless way, they moved in this situation from force to a form of forced collaboration, forced compliance. So they made the victim from passive to active participant in the deal, from being the target to being an associate of them, somebody who did business with them. And later on, they could be told, you did accept this. Yes, we forced you to sign, but we didn't force you to cash the check. So it's a brilliant way to incorporate all these elements in a short scene. This is also interesting because it's, in my mind, this is very Machiavellian. The idea is still Michael explaining how his father operates. Why grant so many favors to so many people? Because this way you build up your influence and you are preparing for hard times. And when I read this passage, what I think is chapter 25th of The Prince, when Machiavelli is talking about the Arno River, about a river flooding the plains, and when the river is full of water and about to invade the fields surrounding the bed of the river, there is no recourse to it. But when the river is quiet, you build up the argents, the embankments, and prepare for a crisis. And those favors are the preparations for a more difficult time, right? This, in a way, is an interesting case of influence. Because in here they're saying, well, Tom became the consigliere even though he was not Sicilian, but why would you want to have a Sicilian by your side? Because it's a question of blood. But they're not talking about family ties so much. They're talking about blood, meaning only a Sicilian would grow up in an environment and develop a culture. In here is called omertà. Omertà means to stay silent when you see a crime, right? In the past, in Sicily, when the police would go to a village, a town, a city after a murder in a public street, in a piazza, in a bar full of people, they would interrogate and nobody had seen anything, right? People would pretend not to have seen anything. But the idea is that if you grew up in that kind of culture, then your own education and upbringing favors the use of influence by your mafia don. So it's an interesting indirect form of influence, and yet they still use Tom, right? And following this is what I referred to the last time, that is to say, when the Don will order the beating of the criminals who were so violent with Bonasera's daughter, he does that carefully by going through different levels so that he's not exposing himself to the consequences. He tells Tom Hagen tells Clemenza, who's one of the capos, the capo regime. Clemenza tells Poligato, who's a made man, and he will tell others. And at this point, the people working with Poli might not be made men, just people who are orbiting around the family, hoping to be accepted into the family itself, right? And the films will often refer to this. And in yellow and green in here, you have the idea that whoever holds the information about who ordered the beating or a killing in other instances and why holds power against the Don. But if you dilute this knowledge, then it's easier to deal with the aftermath or even eliminate someone to stop the escalation, right? Because they would know that, let's say, that Clemenza ordered them, but if you kill Clemenza before the police or neutralize Clemenza in some way, let's say you send it to Sicily, then the police would not get higher than that level and would not be able to get. And this worked in real life, right? That's how so many mafia dons prospered for long. Of course, not too many of them died in their bed, especially during the 1970s and 80s, but what can you do? Even Machiavelli would tell you the system is not perfect. Good enough for a good long period of time, but not perfect, right? And that's the essence of humanism. The humanist, as opposed to an ideal of supernatural perfection that you find in the Middle Ages, for example, right? This is also interesting from a Machiavellian standpoint, the idea that the consigliere is the auxiliary brain of the leader of the mafia family. Because this is what probably Machiavelli had in mind when he talked about Cesare Borgia in chapter 6. And before the end, when he describes the complete failure of Cesare Borgia's career, he refers to an encounter they had in Rome and an exchange of words and how they talked during a crucial time in Cesare Borgia's life and career after his father's death. And probably what Machiavelli is implying is that someone like Cesare Borgia should have someone like Machiavelli next to them, because they would supplement their leadership in areas where they have shortcomings. Shortcomings because their nature is only makes them good leaders for a certain kind of situation. For example, times of war, times of peace, etc. Okay? And this person, the auxiliary brain, the consigliere, must be the closest companion and friend to the Don, which is probably what Machiavelli had in mind. And of course, this knowledge means a lot of power, but what can you do? If you as a consigliere have the Don arrested, then somebody else in the organization will take care of you, which is also the power of the mafia, right? Go back to the situation in A Bronx Tale. If Lorenzo, Calogero's father, had told his kid, go ahead and tell the police what you saw, Sonny would be neutralized, arrested, tried, convicted. But the rest of the organization would have enough power to punish the family of Calogero and Sonny, right? And that's how the mafia inhibits collaboration with the police in a lot of situations. Another example of influence, Tom Hagen is a lawyer, but in this sentence, a lawyer with his briefcase can steal more than 100 men with guns, is a testimony to the idea that force is not the only way to power and control, and the law is the other arm. This is like when Machiavelli says you need the lion and the fox, you need the laws and the animal in you to become a successful leader. And Sonny and Freddie don't have that kind of influence, right? They're just muscle. They enter the family to be used by the family, whereas Michael is really on his own personal path, going to college, and education, college, intellect speaks to the indirect use of power, but then he enlisted in the Marines, fought in the war, he can use force, and therefore he'll be able to use force later on to help his father, right? And this is the dialogue between the lawyer, Tom Hagen, and the producer, promising influence in exchange for a favor, right? They'll help him with the unions, they'll help him with an addicted actor who will not find anyone selling him heroin, and they'll be available within a phone call, within reach, phone reach to help the producer, and the producer will say no. Look at this anecdote used to illuminate Don Vito's power and the way he uses power, right? So starts by saying that the Don had told Tom not to get angry, proceeds to show how the Don can be patient and not be reactive, okay? Don't have to tell you about reactive people these days, reactive leaders. You get the drift. I'm not taking position, I'm just trying to highlight a procedure, a way to behave, okay? But then, notice the dual ending in here, which is also very interesting, because the first ending to this story, to this somewhat hostile confrontation between the Godfather and someone else, is that the Godfather says, oh, no one can reason with this fellow, and exit the rooms. Then they call him back, because at this point they understand that negotiation is over, war will start. An agreement is reached. That would be the first conclusion. But then the other person is killed anyway 2 months later, because his behavior shows that he's not subject to influence, and therefore only force can be used with this person to guarantee long-term control.